Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to this webinar, which will be focused on the topic of UNECE Regulation 155 from the perspective of vehicle manufacturers in principle. My name is Razvan Venter. I work as a group manager for product security testing and certification at Secura, and I will be your host and speaker for the next a bit more than half an hour. Before we start with our content, let me take a moment to introduce Secura as a company. We have been alive in the world of cybersecurity since the year 2000, so a bit more than 20 years now. And for the whole this period, we have been only focused on providing cybersecurity services. Our approach is to have a holistic way in which we approach cybersecurity, and we would like to align as much as possible to relevant standards, regulations, or metrics in the world of either products, but also organization or infrastructure testing and certification. One other remark is that since the beginning of last year, since the beginning of 2021, we are part of Bureau Veritas group, expanding the capabilities of Bureau Veritas in the world of security testing and certification. This diagram presents a bit of an overview of our services. So as you can see, we are pretty broad in what we approach in the world of cybersecurity. We have an approach in which we are split into several areas addressing both public security issues, especially with local government, but also other local institutions, financial aspects, working with banks and other financial organizations, technology focused on mobile or web applications, but also cloud, industrial cybersecurity, and of course, product cybersecurity focused on various types of products such as automotive, medical devices, industrial, network, and so on. And now switching more to the contents of today's presentation, this is the agenda of the topics that we would like to talk about. So what we will do is we'll start with a brief overview of UNECE as an organization and a bit of a background on the landscape of vehicle regulations, how do they fit together. Then we'll zoom in more towards the topic of today, and we'll talk more about the Regulation 155, the cybersecurity regulation from UNECE. We'll start with a brief introduction about Regulation 155 to understand more about the topics that are captured within the text of this regulation, and then we'll zoom in into some topics that we have selected based on what we feel and what we believe that will have an important impact from the perspective of vehicle manufacturers. We'll spend more time diving into those topics, and you'll notice what topics we have selected, which we believe will be relevant for vehicle manufacturers. Of course, at the end of those slides, we'll be able to allocate sufficient time for questions and answers. So please make sure to write your questions in the question box in GoToWebinar, and we'll attempt to answer as many as possible of them by the end of this presentation. And of course, after we finish with the questions, there will also be one final survey that we will kindly ask you to fill. It's optional, but of course, it gives us more insight into your opinion about the webinar, what was good, and of course, what we can improve for the next editions. So that being said, let's go ahead with the first part of the presentation, which is focused on UNECE and the landscape of automotive and vehicle regulations. First of all, UNECE as an organization, it stands for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, a bit of maybe a bit of a misleading name for historic purposes because it contains the word Europe. However, UNECE is really a global organization at this point, covering multiple countries over multiple continents. And of course, that's interesting because from their perspective, as they are dealing with writing and managing vehicle regulations, that is also governing market access for vehicles in all those countries where the UNECE regulations are applicable. So if you as a vehicle manufacturer are interested in manufacturing and also placing your cars, trucks, and so on in either of the countries which fall under the scope of the UNECE regulations, then you need to have the proper market access, the proper vehicle type in place such that you are allowed to place those vehicles on those markets. But of course, that raises an interesting question. How does that work from a mutual recognition perspective? Because of course, it will be pretty inefficient from a vehicle manufacturer perspective to be required to certify your vehicle types over and over again for each countries where you would like to place them. And here is where UNECE comes quite handy with a recognition agreement called the 1958 agreement. The number stands for the year when the agreement was first signed and introduced by the first countries. And all the countries which are members of this agreement, which are represented by the red countries in the slide, they all mutually accept the type approval from each other. So as a vehicle manufacturer, if you're willing to place your vehicles in any of those countries, you would have to certify them one time as a vehicle type, and then all the other red countries will directly recognize the vehicle type approval for that particular vehicle type. Now, how come we all of a sudden have this focus and all this interest around cybersecurity, and what led to the introduction of the Regulation 155 on cybersecurity? Well, historically, if we take a look at how UNECE has been dealing with vehicle regulations over the last decades, over the last years, they have always been in line with the needs of that specific moment in time, of that specific decade. So, of course, the first regulations that we had were for vehicle safety quite a few years ago. Then towards the beginning of end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, we had more and more attention towards emissions. So at that point, there was a new emission regulation to keep that under control. And finally, since recent years, we see a considerable increase in the amount of interest towards connected vehicles and towards the impact of potential cybersecurity issues on those vehicles. What we currently see and what we can always say is that vehicles nowadays, especially modern vehicles, can really be seen as computer on wheels. They are not anymore just objects which help us to get from one point to another, but they come with a set of really dedicated interfaces, which some of them are vehicle specific, but also some of them are, you can also find them in a regular computer or mobile phone, like wireless or USB and so interfaces. And one more important thing to keep into account is that all of those features, all of those interfaces that nowadays are found in a modern vehicle, they're not anymore just aspects that are nice to have or just optional. They are really part of our lives. For example, we could probably hardly imagine a vehicle that doesn't come with a set of interfaces such as wireless, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or USB, or support for smart navigation, or support for voice control. Those are really basic default elements in what we have nowadays in our modern cars. And of course, all of those are more or less exploitable from a security perspective. So that leads to a continuously updatable, continuously increasing avenue of potential attacks from a security perspective. So all of those put together led to important interest from the point of view of UNECE to explore this area more and to start to slowly push the vehicle manufacturers towards a direction of including more cybersecurity aspects by design into their vehicles, such that within just a few years, we can be assured that the vehicles that run on our streets, they are protected against cyber attacks. Now, let's zoom in a bit more into special topics in the particular contents of Regulation 155. Of course, during this webinar, we have limited time, so we will not be able to dive into each and every requirement in the regulation. But our approach will be, as we'll see in a few moments, to start to try to cluster them and explain from a high-level perspective what you can find inside this regulation. To start with the scope of the regulation, this will be quite important, of course, because it defines from a vehicle manufacturer perspective who will be impacted and who will have to ensure compliance for the vehicles in line with Regulation 155. So here we have three types of vehicles that will be in the scope of the regulation. Those are categories M, N, and O of the vehicle classification. And we're talking about vehicles used for transport of passengers, such as cars, but also buses, of course. Vehicles used for transport of goods, such as trucks, for example, and of course, connected trailers, as long as they have at least one ECU inside. But I would say that most of the modern trailers do come with connectivity, so most of them will fall in the scope of the regulation. So that's why we have a scope. What we see, and what we'll also explain a bit later, is that we don't see the suppliers of components in the scope of the regulation. So that means that the regulation will be focused only on vehicle manufacturers, but of course more on that later on during those slides. From a structure perspective, one important thing to already keep into account about this Regulation 155 is that it is split in two main parts. The so-called Cybersecurity Management System, I will keep referring to it as CSMS during the rest of those slides, and the vehicle type requirements. The Cybersecurity Management System is the part that really focuses on the process behind the vehicle. So it's not about technical details of the vehicle architecture, but it's about what processes does the vehicle manufacturer have in place to make sure that the result in the vehicle type is secure by design. and we'll dive in a couple of moments a bit deeper into that topic to understand what kind of processes are needed under the CSMS requirements in the regulation. But anyway, the CSMS milestone is quite important because it's the first thing that the vehicle manufacturer will need to ensure. They will not be allowed to go for vehicle type approval without having first a CSMS certificate in place. We'll talk about it a bit more in a couple of moments. The second type of requirements are focused on vehicle type. Those are more technical requirements that will dive a bit deeper into the technical architecture of the vehicle, but also asking more about test results or risk assessment results for a vehicle type in general. So not process specific, but applied for a type which will be in the scope of the evaluation. From a point of view of the processes, as I mentioned on a previous slide, this will be step one for a vehicle manufacturer. So the vehicle manufacturer will have to get their cybersecurity management system, CSMS, prepared, ready for approval, and then finally apply for approval and get it also certified. This will be step one because in order to apply for further type approvals on top of those processes, you need to have an approved CSMS as a first instance. The resulting certificate for the CSMS will be valid for 3 years. Of course, if there are changes in the processes, then the vehicle manufacturer will have to inform the type approval authority about those changes and potentially get an updated certificate. But in principle, the certificate will be valid for 3 years from the moment when it gets released. And on top of this certificate, vehicle manufacturers can apply for as many type approvals as they wish, as long as they're all developed in line with the approved and certified processes under the CSMS. So now we'll be mentioning a couple of times about the CSMS and about the fact that it includes processes. Let's try to briefly zoom in into what types of processes you can find within the CSMS requirements. We have 4 categories of processes, so we will group them into the next 4 slides and briefly explain about all of them. Later on, we'll also zoom in into 2 of those for more clarity, for more examples. But to start with, the first category is focused on security management and security governance. What does that mean? It means that before starting to build vehicles and before starting to develop vehicles, the vehicle manufacturer needs to have a clear governance structure inside the organization. So it needs to be clear who is in charge of cybersecurity, who is ultimately responsible for implementing cybersecurity, and how is that governance split within all the teams which are in charge of developing new and secure vehicles. Furthermore, there's one more important remark, the fact that all the people who are involved in the development of a new vehicle, but not only development, but also testing and validation, for example, or risk assessment, they need to have the proper skills and competences, and those skills and competences need to be managed in a proper way by the vehicle manufacturer. So that's what this part of the process is focusing about. The second type of requirements, and one important category, which we'll also dive in a bit of a zoom-in fashion in a couple of moments, is focused on risk management. Risk management is quite a big suite of requirements and quite a big suite of processes which are captured in the regulation. It starts with the idea of identifying the scope of the vehicle, which is cybersecurity relevant, because of course not the whole vehicle might necessarily fall in the scope of the regulation. If there are parts or components which don't impact security, then they don't have to be in scope. But after identifying the scope, then the vehicle manufacturer will have to go ahead and start to identify the assets, the threats, the possible attack scenarios, and ultimately the security risks that are applicable to their vehicle. That needs to be properly documented and defined as a process. As a next step, once the threats and the risks are being identified, the next step will be to identify security controls to mitigate those threats and ideally bring them down to a lower level. And of course, those controls will also need to be tested and validated. Finally, the level of residual risks, which will remain in place after the security controls have been implemented, will have to be analyzed, and the vehicle manufacturer will have to understand and decide if those residual risks are low enough such that can be accepted, or otherwise if they still need to be further treated with more security controls. Now, a vehicle could be secure the moment when it is first developed and first approved and first hits the streets, but it doesn't mean that the second day there couldn't be a new security vulnerability that might impact the vehicle. Therefore, especially in the phases of production and post-production, vehicle manufacturers need to really have strong processes that deal with security incidents and security vulnerabilities. And those processes will need to make sure that the manufacturer is able to detect security incidents that might impact the vehicle, but also actively monitor for potentially new vulnerabilities that could impact the vehicle as well. Of course, there's also the second part of the question. If there's a new incident or a new vulnerability, how is the vehicle manufacturer able to react to it and make sure that the vehicle is not impacted or the vehicle is sufficiently patched? So all of those, they need to be taken properly into account and properly documented as a process. And finally, the last cluster of requirements, but for sure not the least, is the requirements which are dealing with supply chain interaction. There is only one requirement, however, as we'll see in a couple of moments, it starts to cascade quite deep. And this requirement is asking the vehicle manufacturers to be in control, to be in charge of the risks from all their supply chain partners. And of course, thinking that a vehicle manufacturer typically works with dozens or maybe even more suppliers of components, but also backend related software and applications, that will come in as a pretty important and most likely time-consuming requirement, because the vehicle manufacturer will be given the task of interacting with the whole supply chain, making sure that they have in place the proper contractual agreements, and also that they collect and validate quite a set of evidence from the suppliers. We'll talk about it a bit more in a couple of moments. Now, we talked about the CSMS for quite a bit. Let's try to briefly understand what do we mean from a vehicle type perspective. Well, the CSMS is asking for all the processes. So as part of the CSMS, all the processes will be defined and ideally finally approved and certified by the vehicle manufacturer. To put it short, the vehicle type assessment will try to determine that the vehicle manufacturer is properly applying those processes when they define and when they build a new vehicle. So when we're talking about the risk assessment processes from a CSMS perspective, then from a vehicle perspective, all those results will have to be in place for the vehicle architecture. And the same for testing, and the same for incidents and vulnerabilities. So the applicability of those processes and procedures for the vehicle type is what we want to see in place when we would do a vehicle type assessment. It was a brief scroll through the requirements of the R155, well, a bit more focused on the process side for the CSMS and with a bit of an explanation for the vehicle type. So now in the second part of this presentation, let's select two of those categories, and we will select the risk assessment part and the supplier interaction part, and try to understand a bit more from the possible impact on OEMs, on vehicle manufacturers. What will those requirements mean, and how should vehicle manufacturers keep it in mind, and how should they prepare about it? One thing that I would like to highlight is, at the risk of slightly repeating the slide, but what I would like to highlight is that the regulation clearly says that component suppliers, they are not in the scope of the regulation. So one question that we get, in fact, quite often ourselves as a technical service from possible component manufacturers is, can we get type approved from the regulation? And the answer is that they cannot. As a component manufacturer, if you're manufacturing ECUs or automotive systems or automotive software, you are not in the scope of the regulation. However, the vehicle manufacturers, they are, and we have talked about connected cars, buses, trucks, trailers, and so on. And all of those manufacturers will have the task of interacting with the suppliers, with their suppliers, and making sure that their suppliers are up to speed. However, the suppliers themselves cannot trigger this process, they cannot get certified. And this will come in as an important remark within a couple of moments when we talk about supply chain dependencies. We have talked about the two parts, so let's explain a bit more about, at a very high level, of course, what sort of evidence will a vehicle manufacturer have to prepare for both the CSMS part, the process part, but also for the vehicle type assessment. And again, keep in mind that the CSMS is focused on processes, the vehicle type requirements and evidence is focused on technical evidence and practical applicability of the process on the vehicle itself. So when we talk about the CSMS evidence, we really, from a technical service perspective, when we would audit a vehicle manufacturer, we would try to look that all the necessary processes are existing, drafted, in place, and also applied, so mature enough such that the vehicle manufacturer can rely on those processes. Of course, we can follow the requirements of the regulation to get more insight into what is needed. But to get an idea, you can think about examples such as the cybersecurity policy, the cybersecurity handbook of an organization, which defines the principles based on which they approach cybersecurity. This needs to be documented and existing and of course followed by everyone who is involved in the design of the vehicle. The process based on which the vehicle manufacturers keeps track of its skills and competences for all the people who are involved in the process of defining of developing and defining a new vehicle. That one also needs to be in place. The organizational structure, the security governance, that needs to be clearly defined. So there needs to be a clear procedure based on which someone is in charge of something, and that needs to be followed when a real project is started. Security development and post-development. Here we can think about the whole journey of a new vehicle from the concept phase all the way to the development phase and post-development, and all those activities that need to be properly documented such that whenever the vehicle manufacturer decides to define a new vehicle, it doesn't always follow a different track, but all the activities and all the objectives and so on and deliverables, work products, they are always the same. Of course, there are some standards such as ISO 2144, which could be applied by vehicle manufacturers to support them in those procedures. But the process needs to be always the same and needs to be mature enough. We have talked before about risk management and of course the risk management process. So how does the manufacturer identify threats, assets, damage scenarios? How do they rate risks? And how do they define security controls to address those risks? That needs to be properly documented. Incident response and security monitoring, the same. And by the way, keep in mind that this needs to address both the vehicle itself as well as the backend part, which connects to the vehicle and which could fall in the scope of the regulation as well. And finally, the process of dealing with the supply chain. So how are the suppliers selected? How are all the contractual agreements made? What kind of evidence is being asked from the supplier from a security perspective? And how is that evidence reviewed and approved? All those things, they have to be documented and have to be mature enough on the side of the OEM. One important remark is that for the CSMS perspective, you don't need to have evidence for all of those processes. That will come later on for the vehicle type, but only the process itself in a documented version and in a mature version needs to be in place, and that will be sufficient to get your CSMS approval. From a vehicle type perspective, I think we can spend a bit less time here, but once you have all the processes in place, that's only from a process perspective. And then for a vehicle type perspective, you will need to have the complete set of technical evidence, such as the vehicle architecture, the whole set of vehicle risks, the whole set of vehicle testing results, evidence from all the suppliers for all the components and for all the services which are in the scope of the vehicle, and of course, examples of how do you do security monitoring and how do you do incident response on the vehicle by itself. So it's a difference between process on one side, process with some examples for the CSMS, and whole set of vehicle evidence when you go and when you apply for a vehicle type. We have talked quite a bit about risk management, so let's zoom in for just a couple of moments on this particular type of requirements, because it will be one of the most important aspects. If we simply look at the contents of the regulation, we see that there are many requirements which are asking for risk management and for risk management approach, evidence. So let's take a look at this diagram in which in the middle we have put risk management, and all around we have some particular aspects of risk management, starting with defining the scope, then defining the assets into the vehicle, defining the security threats. And here the regulation itself comes in handy because it has one annex called Annex 5, which comes as a baseline of threats that need to be considered by the OEM, trying to define attack scenarios, end up with risk ratings, define security controls to address those provisional risks, and finally end up with the process in which the residual risks are either accepted or they are concluded to be still high enough such that they have to be further treated by the manufacturer. So all the suite of processes that revolves around risk management, that needs to be taken into account by the OEM. And of course, already from this slide, it looks like there will be quite a bit of work. Also keeping in mind that there is not only one component that we're talking about, but there are dozens or even hundreds of components in the vehicle, plus the backend side. So this will be quite an effort-consuming activity. And keep in mind that for type approval, you will need to have a complete set for all of those elements. Talking about risk rating, the ISO 2144 approach is for now out of scope of this webinar, but anyway, manufacturers can definitely look at this standard to get more insight into how to rate risks based on the impact and feasibility. And the ISO 2144 provides a very valuable approach, a very good approach to understand how to rate risks and how to define the level of final risk and residual risk based on matrices such that you can see on the bottom of the slide. So we have always encouraged the manufacturers to take a look at this standard and to try to define the risk assessment approach, if possible, as much as possible, in line with the ISO 2144 approach. In terms of testing, one question that we get sometimes is, what would be the role of the technical service? Will the technical service perform all the testing, or is there also testing that is expected to come from the side of the OEM? And the answer is that there's something in between. However, the focus is more on the OEM side. So once the OEM has defined all the controls, all the mitigations, preferably in line with the Annex 5 of the regulation, so all the mitigations that will be put into the vehicle manufacturer, the OEM, will have also the responsibility to test all those mitigations. It actually goes in line with one of the processes which are part of the CSMS. So that process is asking for test results. Therefore, when a vehicle manufacturer is applying for the type approval, they will need to have a portfolio of all the test results for the complete vehicle. So again, that might be quite a bit of testing that we have to keep into account. The technical service will have limited time for testing, and of course that comes in from an efficiency perspective. Otherwise, there will be a lot of effort spent into testing the whole vehicle. So the technical service will select a few critical or high impact targets within the vehicle itself, but could be also in the backend based on the results of the risk assessment, so preferably the high and critical risks, and focus on those targets for the purpose of testing. However, the bulk of the test results will still need to be provided by the vehicle manufacturer. And again, we could be talking about some considerable amount of testing that the OEM will need to take into account. A few advices, because we have been talking about this with several manufacturers, and we have been supporting several manufacturers to go through risk assessment, either from an evidence perspective or from a testing perspective. And we do advise to start early in the process. It sounds like only one requirement, however, it cascades down to a lot of elements, so it will take quite a bit of time. A good scoping is critical, so you have to make sure in the beginning to identify all the components and all the backend elements that will be in scope. In this way, you make sure that there are no surprises later on with particularly missed applications or particularly missed components that you have to run through the risk assessment process. Interact with your suppliers, because there's going to be quite a bit of back and forth to obtain the evidence from their own risk assessment or their own testing if the vehicle manufacturer is not in charge of that component, and most of the times probably they will not be in charge of those components. And finally, make sure to reserve a buffer to analyze and potentially address the results of risk assessment. Imagine that there are some more mitigations that need to be done based on the results of the risk assessment. You don't want to be in a situation where you have only a few number of months before the release of the type of the vehicle type in which you have to address those mitigations, because that will probably be very, very short, very, very tight time. So make sure to reserve a buffer to analyze those results from the risk assessment. The second category of processes, of requirements that we would like to zoom in for just a couple of minutes is focused on supply chain. And the reason why we chose supply chain is because while it might be a bit misleading in the regulation, there's only one requirement that highlights supply chain, is requirement 7225. Still, it's pretty important because vehicle manufacturers nowadays, modern manufacturers, depend quite a lot, actually really a lot, on the supply chain for all the components and most of the software that takes place in their vehicles. So dealing with supply chain will become very important. There are quite a few things that need to be taken into account, such as contractual agreements, such as collecting evidence from the supply chain, quite a bit of back and forth interaction to agree on those contractual agreements, to agree on getting evidence. Maybe there will be some gaps in the evidence. So the interaction will most likely take a bit of time. And also manufacturers need to keep in mind that the supplier interaction and evidence will not be a one-time activity, but it needs to happen periodically with all the vehicle updates and all the software updates that are coming from the supplier side. So let's take a couple of moments to look into the contractual clauses. There are quite a few, but we wanted to highlight some of them which could be important to already keep into account for vehicle manufacturers. So we are talking about agreement for security training and governance on the supplier side, agreement for providing input on every design updates from the suppliers, agreement for risk assessment results, for testing evidence, for security monitoring activities, and finally agreement to provide updates and also support for incident response. So all of those are contractual agreements. At this point, there's formally nothing more than a signature needed, but of course, it's not as easy as it seems. It's easy to ask for security monitoring results and support, but of course, we always notice that there's a bit of a back and forth interaction between the manufacturer and a supplier to make sure that all those agreements are captured properly and they are signed and agreed in a proper fashion. So make sure to reserve some time for that, definitely in this process. From a point of view of the evidence, we have been able to scope out quite clearly what will need to be provided by the suppliers towards the manufacturers. And we are talking about risk assessment results for the components and for the software that will be provided towards the manufacturers, testing evidence, because most of the times the suppliers themselves have a much better capability to provide testing evidence than the manufacturers have to test on those ECUs, of course, based on the knowledge and based on the design of the ECUs. The suppliers are in a better suited position to provide those results. The same for risk assessment, by the way. Whenever needed, information about a new vulnerability or a new incident that could impact those delivered components or services, and also details about the security governance on the supplier side and evidence of how they keep track of internal training, internal skills, and internal competences. So those are the four major pieces of information that suppliers need to prepare. Of course, again, it looks short, but in practice, we see that there will be quite likely a bit of effort spent into this. So the advice, again, would be to start early, if possible. From an advice perspective, I already mentioned a couple of times, start early, and this finds itself as the first bullet point on this list. It will be most likely quite a bit of work. We are talking about dozens of suppliers, so it's most likely not going to be a short list. I think it's going to be a long list in the case of most manufacturers, and all of those suppliers will have to go through the process of obtaining the contractual agreements, of obtaining information, a bit of back and forth communication about the information. Maybe there'll be some gaps. So my advice: start as early as possible. Work on obtaining contractual agreements. That will probably require some rounds of interaction, also with the legal departments of both the manufacturer as well as the supplier, most likely. Obtain the evidence, also in the first moment, but also periodically, because some evidence, such as updated design details or new vulnerabilities, new incidents, they're not only at the first moment, but they could also come throughout time. So agree on a way to share this evidence and review this evidence. And also reserve sufficient time in case you might need to look for alternative suppliers. It could happen that your supplier mentions that they cannot be compliant with R155 for various reasons, and in that case, you would want to avoid that you end up in that situation late in the process, because it could potentially impact your timeline for the vehicle type. So again, advice remains: start early and reserve some time at the end for potential updates or potential changes in the interaction with the suppliers. Now that we've gone through the main concepts of the regulation, and also we have tried to zoom in on two categories, let's summarize what we have gone through the last a bit more than half an hour. So good preparation will be the basis of this regulation. There's still a bit of time. The regulation will not be active for a few more months, but vehicle manufacturers, whenever they want to include a new vehicle type, they're always advised to prepare well in time. So start early, take sufficient time for generating all the processes, collecting evidence, create your evidence, and again, be prepared for discussions, especially with the suppliers, because there's going to be a lot of interaction, a lot of dependencies between the vehicle manufacturer and the suppliers of components or with services. Talking about timeline, we already mentioned on the previous slide that the regulation is close to become live, and well, while the regulation was already drafted and approved from last year, from 2021, since July this year, 2022, the regulation will become mandatory for all new vehicle types in the European Union. So if you're a manufacturer and you plan to place a new vehicle type after July in any of the countries of the European Union, you will have to go through a CSMS approval as a first step, and then you will have to go through a type approval perspective based on R155 as a second step. So important to keep to be aware of this timeline for implementation. And by the way, if you're targeting the Japan market, the regulation is already live. It has been live already from last year, and this evidence is already required if you are interested in placing your vehicles into the Japanese market. So in conclusion, we are very close now to the end of this webinar, but very interesting times ahead. We as Secura, we have been trying to be involved in the world of this regulation from an early phase. So we joined it from the moment when it was in a first draft phase. We've been through a pretty interesting and successful pilot phase with a few OEMs. And currently we are in a position of a recognized technical service under 2 approval authorities, E4 in the Netherlands and E49 in Cyprus. Therefore, we can support interested OEMs with a variety of services, starting with training, with an initial training, initial workshop, and going all the way to gap analysis, support with gaps, and of course, the official audit and official certification. So feel free to reach out to us. We are very happy to have a first chat with you, learn more about your needs, and see how we can help you further. Of course, we do have quite a few materials on our website, so feel free to navigate to secura.com, and there's a dedicated section on automotive. We have a few fact sheets that we have been writing over the last months, which might be interesting for you to find out more about Regulation 155. And finally, this webinar has been only the first in a series of upcoming events, both trainings as well as webinars focused on automotive. There will be a training specifically focused on ISO 2144 in 2 weeks from now, end of April, and furthermore, 2 more webinars, one focused on risk assessment and one focused on cybersecurity regulation, but this time more focused from the perspective of the suppliers. So similar idea with today, but different focus, because today we talked OEMs. Next time we'll talk about how will the suppliers be impacted by this regulation. So stay tuned, because there's more content coming soon from our side here at Secura. And that being said, I would like to thank you for your attention and for staying with me over the last 35 minutes or so, and very much looking forward to take some questions now. So the questions are already coming in. I'm taking a look at the question box. So let's select a few of those. If we don't have time for all the questions, then I will make sure to reply offline to all of them after the session. Let's take a first question, and the question says, is the CSMS mandatory for a first tier supplier? That's a good question, and I tried to explain about it during the slides, but let's mention it once again, because it's an important topic. So the regulation by itself, the scope of the regulation only addresses vehicle manufacturers. So that being said, suppliers, both tier 1 but also tier 2, tier 3, and so on, they are not in scope of the regulation. They cannot be type approved. However, if you are a vehicle manufacturer, most likely you will reach out to your suppliers and start asking them questions about risk assessment, about testing, about incidents. Therefore, a part of the regulation will be cascaded, translated towards the suppliers as well. So this is how indirectly the suppliers will become in the scope of this regulation. So the answer to my answer to your question, thank you very much for it once again, is that it's not by definition applicable. However, the suppliers, tier 1 suppliers, will be dragged into this game, and most likely will be asked by vehicle manufacturer to prepare and to share a certain set of evidence. Let's take a couple of moments to take a look at another question. What do your current OEM customers consider the hardest part in this new regulation? Well, this is an interesting question, and of course it does depend from case to case. Well, definitely there are some aspects based on which an OEM might consider something more easier or more of a challenge. For example, I would be tempted to say that the supplier interaction is typically a very challenging point for many OEMs, and the reason is simply because many OEMs rely a lot on the supply chain. So that means that they have a lot of suppliers. So therefore, they will have to reach out to each and all of those suppliers and start collecting evidence such as contractual agreements, risk assessment results, testing results, and so on. And it's not only about collecting, but it's also about reviewing and validating and potentially going back to customers with those kind of insights. So it's not a very challenging topic. However, it's pretty extensive, thinking about the number of suppliers, and therefore it will take quite a bit of time in order to make sure that all those suppliers are properly tackled. So my personal suggestion, I think that OEMs will have a challenging time in making sure that they are compliant from a supplier perspective. Again, the advice, start early in time and make sure that you allocate sufficient time to this. Let's pick one more until our time is up for this session. And this question is asking whether standards such as ISO 2144 might be a good candidate to demonstrate compliance with regulation 155. Thank you very much for asking it. Good question, and the simple answer is yes. Of course, with a disclaimer that it depends a bit. If you are already in the position where you have considered cybersecurity in your processes for a while, so it doesn't come as a new thing for you, in that case, you don't have to migrate towards ISO 2144. You can stick to your current processes in which you already included cybersecurity and define your CSMS in line with your existing processes. However, if cybersecurity is slightly more of a new topic to you as a vehicle manufacturer, or you would like to have a more clear approach about what is risk assessment, what is testing, what you have to have in place, then ISO 2144 helps quite a lot, because there's a very good mapping you could have between the requirements of R155 and the requirements of ISO 2144. In fact, the regulation itself comes with this mapping. And that being said, if you have questions about how to address topics such as risk assessment or security testing from a concrete implementation perspective, like what are the deliverables, what are the work products, then an approach based on ISO 2144 is a very preferable one. And by the way, many approval authorities are actually suggesting ISO 2144 for specific aspects such as risk assessment. So dealing with rating threats, rating impacts, calculating risk levels, that is being recommended and strongly suggested by many vehicle approval authorities. So long story short, yes, it's always a good idea to focus on ISO 2144 to address your compliance needs. So there are still a few more questions. I am afraid we will not have time to answer all of them in the remaining moments because our time is almost up. So I would like now to go towards the end of this session. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's been very nice to talk again about the world of Regulation 155, and hopefully our vehicle manufacturers in the audience have found a bit more clarity about this regulation. How does it apply to them? And I hope the selected use cases for risk assessment and for supplier interaction have been useful for your current questions. I will make sure to answer the remaining questions in an offline manner, so you'll receive your answer independently by email for all your questions. But otherwise, thank you for joining in. If possible, feel free to join to fill our webinar survey, which will pop up when you close the GoToWebinar application. And very much looking forward to talk to you once again next time and talk more about automotive and Regulation 155. Thank you very much and have a nice day.